Welcome back to The Heat in our special edition of the show on this presidential election night here in the United States. We turn now to the shift in the international order and the emergence of the global south. With the rapid rise of China and countries like India, South Africa and Brazil gaining more prominence too, how will the next U.S. president interact with this changing world? And what can we expect for U.S.-Russia relations as either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump heads to the White House? In a few moments, I will talk with Liu Xian, who is joining us from Geneva, where she is CCTV's bureau chief. But we begin in Russia. Joining me now from Moscow is Dmitry Babich. He is a correspondent and journalist for Sputnik International. Dmitry, welcome to the show.
Yes, nice to hear from you.
Now, relations between Russia and the United States are at their lowest point in decades. Do you expect any serious improvement in that relationship after the election?
Well, it depends on who will win. Under Hillary Clinton, I think relations will not improve for a long time. Donald Trump is a big enigma for Russians. I don't believe the rumors that Russians have supported him during the election, because I interviewed many people in the Russian elite. I know the mood in the media. Donald Trump was seen as a flamboyant figure. He is interesting, but he is not interesting as a person. He is interesting as a phenomenon. You know, obviously a lot of people in the United States are angry with politics as usual if they cracked up to be ready to support such a candidate. So if Donald Trump wins, there is a possibility that he will have a prolonged fight with the Congress, and the U.S. foreign policy will become less aggressive for the next 6 or 8 months until they oust him or make him just another U.S. president like Obama or George Bush the Jr. before him. So I don't expect much of an improvement in the long term, unfortunately.
Now, the one view is that Russia has been very hostile towards the United States, that President Putin in particular has been manipulating this election behind the scenes. The other view of that, of course, it's that is just election rhetoric here in the United States. And you say it will take some time before Hillary Clinton, if she becomes president, would try to reset relations with Russia. But she's going to have to deal with Russia on a day-to-day basis on international issues like the Syrian war. So would there be some kind of reach out by the United States to Russia in the aftermath of this election?
Well, on the first theme, of course, Russia has no clout on U.S. elections. As Vladimir Putin joked a few days ago, speaking to the Valdai discussion club, the United States is not a banana republic to be manipulated by a country tens of thousands of miles away, you know. And all of these so-called reports about Russia's involvement in the U.S. election, about Russia hacking the DNC. I mean, these are not cases of election rhetoric. These are just plain lies. Speaking about the United States reaching out to Russia, unfortunately, Russia has some very bad experience with Hillary Clinton. When she became the Secretary of State in 2009, 2010, she already started the so-called reset with Russia, but it turned out to be completely fake. She said a lot of awful things about Russia later on. She compared Putin several times to Hitler. Putin is a very patient man, that he continues to talk to the people who compared him to Hitler. He talked to Cameron after such comparisons. He will talk to Hillary Clinton, but that is just irresponsible politics on her side. So I think that Russia will be ready for improvement of relations, as always. Russia is always ready for improvement of relations, but I don't expect a so-called reach out from Hillary Clinton.
Okay, thanks, Dmitry. That's Dmitry Babich, journalist and political analyst with Sputnik International. Joining me now from Geneva is Liu Xian. She is a correspondent and bureau chief for CCTV. Liu Xian, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Anand, for having me.
We are watching a new world order emerge right now. China has become an economic powerhouse. We have other countries like India who are major economic players. We see other countries emerging in the world. Old relationships are changing, they're evolving. We see that in the relationship between the United States and the Philippines. So, how does a new US president deal with this changing international landscape?
Well, I think whether it is Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton who wins the presidential election, they would all have to keep their head out of the sand and look around and see very clearly what is happening in the world. The fact is, emerging economy, as you mentioned, are playing an increasingly important role. Emerging economies are accounting for 60% of the world's economic growth, just to give you an idea of that. And that is a trend that will not be stopped. The world, as the Chinese spokesperson for the National People's Congress, Fu Ying, put most recently, the world has changed from bloc politics to themes on development and cooperation, and there are more powers in this world than just one or two superpowers. A study or a prediction by the 2008 volume of the U.S. National Intelligence Council's Global Trends states that by 2025, the international system will be a global multipolar one. That forecast is deemed to be correct, although whether or not that's going to happen so soon is still a question. So that is the unstoppable trend, and people will have to take a good look at that. Finally, it is also in the U.S. interest to engage with developing countries, with China. So indeed, whether you like it or not, the world has changed, and it is only sensible to take a good look at the reality and say, this is the reality, we need to adjust our policies.
Right, as you say, the world has changed and is changing very rapidly. But for the past few years, well, for many years, the United States has promoted this view, something called American exceptionalism, a view that it is superior to the rest of the world, that it is unique in the world. It's a view that's even promoted by President Obama. If that kind of view continues here in the United States, I mean, what are the dangers of viewing the world in such a way?
I think it is a very dangerous trend. Of course, America is still the most powerful country in the world in terms of both hard power and soft power. But the dynamics are changing, and there are emerging polars that are coming from different parts of the world. For instance, Europe, for instance, China, Russia, and Japan, and other countries. So, taking that into consideration, you cannot put yourself above everybody else and say, I'm different, I'm exceptional, I'm superior, and you need to take my value, either you like it or you don't. The consequences of that, I would say, in two fronts. One is to the rest of the world, to other countries, and one for the United States. For the rest of the country, it is very dangerous, as we have seen in the cases of the war in Iraq, in the cases of the war in Libya, where the U.S. acted unilaterally and inflicted a great danger. Right now, we're still seeing the tragedy unfolding, and we don't know how these situations will eventually get better. And in the case of Syria as well, we are seeing that without cooperation with other countries, without respecting other countries' interests and rights, you simply cannot solve the problems that the world is faced at this moment. On economic and trade front, it's the same question. If you put your interest above everybody else's, you are bound to run into more trade disputes with other countries. And for the United States, in terms of against the backdrop of a sluggish economic growth and recovery, you cannot afford such kind of confrontation. And for the United States, besides the economic perspective, you risk losing friends, you risk losing allies. And the case of the Philippines is a good example. And I'm sure that the American people or the American government will not want to see that.
Right, and if we look at China, what China has been doing, China has played a major role in recent years in investment in Africa, in Latin America. China was instrumental in setting up that bank, the development bank, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. It's launched that major economic initiative, the One Belt, One Road initiative. Does that tell us that the world is moving on, despite the fact that the United States may think that it's still able to dictate the pace of change and what goes on in the world?
I think more and more so, and the most recent example, as you mentioned, the AIIB, the bank, the US was very much opposed to the idea that the UK joins the bank as a founding member. However, the UK did what was in their best interest against the will of the United States, and actually they were one of the first to join in that bank. So that was a very good example. And you mentioned the case of Latin America. Just last year, Chinese President Xi Jinping pledged that China will invest some $250 billion in Latin America, and over the next 10 years. And the two-way trade between China and Latin America are expected to rise to $500 billion over the next 10 years. So there is great potential, and whether the U.S. likes it or not, because Latin America is traditionally where their influence has been dominating, whether the U.S. likes it or not, China and Latin America are coming closer. So I think it is really the time to take a good look at the changing reality and say, okay, this is the world now, and that's how it's going to be in the future. On the other hand, I would say the U.S. administration and the U.S. people need to have a better understanding of what China thinks is the future. What kind of picture does the Chinese leadership have in their head for the world? We're not talking about a world order where one country or two countries dominate the rest of the community. We're talking about a community of shared destiny, and we're actually happy where we are, because since the past 45 years that China regained its seat in the UN, in the United Nations, China has been growing rapidly and successfully. So we have no problem with the current international system, except that it needs to be fairer, it needs to be more equitable and more inclusive, representing emerging, developing economies more. So we're not trying to overthrow the current system and build a totally new one. The U.S. government, the U.S. people need not to worry about that.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks for joining us.